Mhm. Right. Shah, did you get my request?
Yes.
All right, we are ready to begin. Hello, everybody. So since 2019, we have witnessed the Lebanese diaspora mobilize and reclaim their roots. It wasn't easy. We watched our beautiful Beirut collapse from miles and miles away. We heard the cries of mothers, fathers, daughters, brothers, and sisters merely from behind a flat digital screen. We watched our life savings invested in Lebanon, hoping one day we could build a foundation for our kids to return in the future, fade away in a blink of an eye. But regardless, here we are trying over and over not to lose hope. We are trying to build the Lebanon that we want from all over the world. And today, from Los Angeles, California, Meghterbin Mejtemiin is reminding the Lebanese in general and the diaspora in particular that the fight is not over until we say so. To succeed, we need to be equipped with the right knowledge and insight. And to do so, we have to understand the roots of the problem and the truth behind it. Today, the Lebanese history has always been a subject of controversy. And it is because of that controversy, we always find it difficult to be connected with our roots. Is it because the political class do not want us to understand and identify our mistakes? What are they afraid of? Today, we will try to unwrap some of those questions, and there is no better way to start our mission than with the one and only, the Lebanese and Middle Eastern historian, heritage expert, and founder of Heritage and Roots, Mr. Charles Hayek. Hi, Charles.
Hi, Silvana. Thank you for having me tonight. It's a pleasure and an honor to be able to connect with through Meghterbin Mejtemiin with the Lebanese diaspora. I think there is a small technical problem related to echo. So let's see how we can. Because we can't mute either of the.
No, ما في أعمل mute.
No, we can't. Okay, so let's start.
فينا نتحمل الميوت شوي ولا okay, whoever هلا مني okay with the earphones already has هلا أحسن.
I think I'll go with another solution. I'll put my headphones and speak through them to the laptop, and it will be the best solution.
Okay, we both are using your.
Okay, is it good now? Is it better? No? No?
هلا.
It's your speaker, Silvana, I think. That should be muted.
حطيت earphone and still the same.
The echo is only when you speak.
Charles, start, and I will mute myself, so heck, we make things easy. Okay?
I can't hear you.
هلا. أحسن? Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah, I think it's better now. Okay. Shall we proceed?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, so our question tonight is how and when the first Lebanese diaspora emerged. The birth of the Lebanese diaspora is a very complex process that began in the second half of the 19th century and constituted what we call the first phase of the Lebanese diaspora, and that shortly ended with the birth of with World War I. So let's try to answer some basic questions. When did they leave? Why did they leave? And what was the role of the Lebanese diaspora in the emergence and the birth and the establishment of a new state, practically 1 century ago, that of Greater Lebanon. So, did you mute, Silvana, your okay, because they're saying in the battery echo. So, the first Lebanese immigrant was Antonios el-Bish'ilani. This is one of the rare portraits that we have of him. He was the first Lebanese to go to the United States. We don't know much about him. We know that he left what was then Ottoman Mount Lebanon, the village of Salima. This is one of the rare pictures that we have of Salima around the mid-19th century. This village is dominated by a massive sarai or palace that belonged to the local feudal family, feudal between brackets, the Abil-Lama. These families, this is one of, this is an Orientalist painting that represents one of the Abil-Lama emirs, one of the emirs
that that lived in that palace. This class owned land, and this class owned the right to manage land, to tax farm, and they had like small armed bands and militias. So they were the ruling class. And in the mid-19th century, there were many peasant uprisings that took later on a sectarian dimension to get rid of this class. This is when the first Lebanese immigrant left. He left in the context of a peasant uprising, of many peasant uprisings that were demanding their share to manage the land, lower taxes, and of course, the end of the privileges of this class. Back then, Lebanon was divided, what was Mount Lebanon, was divided into two political administrative sections. A northern Qa'im Maqamiyya, an Ottoman administrative term that simply means a district reserved for the Maronites, and a southern one reserved for the Druze. This sectarian administration of Mount Lebanon was proposed by the Prime Minister of the Austrian Empire, Metternich, to kind of find a solution to end the sectarian strife that took place after the older administrative system, where a local multazim, that we call in Lebanese history an emir, was in charge of tax farming, and this system completely collapsed in 1841. The painting, by another French Orientalist, gives you an idea about how Lebanese women dressed. The soldiers under the tree and on the donkey or horse are Ottoman soldiers. The women near Al-Ain, the public fountain, were actually doing something essential for survival back then. It's to go and to bring water back to home, because there was no running water in the peasant housing. So Antonios el-Bish'ilani arrived to Boston Harbor in 1854, and he died quite young in 1856 on his 21st birthday. So this is a symbolic figure. He is the first one to leave what was then Ottoman Mount Lebanon. Let's start to understand first the narratives around this first Lebanese diaspora and the historical reasons that pushed 25 to 30, and some estimates go as high as 40% of the Lebanese population. In the past, some have attributed this human movement to persecution of Christians, who made up a large percentage, especially the Maronites, of the immigrants, and mostly came from Mount Lebanon. So this narrative is still, to this day, accepted as the narrative that explained this. Oppression by the Ottomans and attacks by the Druze or Muslims made life untenable for these peasants and townfolk and drove them out of their homes. Well, history tells us a different story. First, this narrative was developed originally by some of these newcomers to elicit sympathies of immigration officials at Ellis Island and facilitate their entry to the US. We can trace some violence and repression, neither of which was one-sided. The fact remains that the period of this first phase of immigration and how this led to the formation of the first wave of the first phase of the Lebanese diaspora between 1861 and 1814 was known as the Long Peace. This is one of the longest period of peace in modern Lebanese history. The inhabitants of Mount Lebanon, from where they came, enjoyed back then many advantages that nearby districts in the Ottoman Empire did not have. What were the privileges? The map you see, if you're following us on YouTube, is that of Mutasarrifiyat Jabal Lubnan. The Mutasarrifiyya was a new administrative system that was adopted in 1861. It was kind of a solution to the most violent sectarian war. In the mid-19th century, Lebanon witnessed 3 sectarian wars: 1841, 1845, and the third in 1860. The third was the most violent, and the solution was to grant Mount Lebanon self-rule and to create this Mutasarrifiyya. Mutasarrifiyya in Ottoman administration, it's a sub-province. What did this Mutasarrifiyya enjoy? It enjoyed self-rule, an elected governing council that was elected on sectarian basis. This is where we can trace the sectarian system in Lebanon, the beginnings. A local gendarmerie, police force trained by the French, a rapidly growing infrastructure of roads, local schools and missionary schools, waterwork, and by the late 19th century, even thriving tourism, especially the wealthy Egyptian bashas and bourgeois and some Orientalists who were coming to visit and enjoy scenery and food in Mount Lebanon. Also, it had French political and economic influence, very strong French and economic influence, and lower taxes than other Ottoman districts and provinces, and exemption from conscription into the Ottoman army. So if these inhabitants of Mount Lebanon enjoyed all of these privileges, why did they leave? There's another reason that the common narrative does not shed light on. So if this sectarian, alleged sectarian persecution and conscription into the ranks of the Ottoman army were not the overwhelming reasons for emigration, then what prompted such a massive movement where anywhere from 15 to 50% of villages were emptied out? We need to understand that back then, the second half of the 19th century, there is something that the historians call the Great Migration, global Great Migration. So the majority left for economic reasons. And they were part of this global great migration of the 19th century, which saw the movement of millions leaving poor economic conditions, especially around the Mediterranean, or the southern and eastern Mediterranean, from places such the Ottoman Empire, Italy, Greece, to countries that were in desperate need for labor, like the US, Argentina, and Brazil. In other words, immigrants from the Eastern Mediterranean or from the Ottoman Empire or Italy or Greece left limited opportunities in their homeland for better possibilities somewhere else to make money and then return home. So this is something that we need to keep in mind. Persecution was not behind the birth of the first Lebanese diaspora. So let's zoom in on Mount Lebanon as we advance. Especially the stagnation and then collapse of the silk economy of Mount Lebanon, which accounted for 60% of the GDP of Mount Lebanon by the beginning of the 20th century. And textile manufacturing in the hinterlands of Greater Syria forced many to seek better livelihoods in the prospering lands of the Americas. So what is this link between silk and the Lebanese diaspora? Silk was produced at least since the 5th century in the Eastern Mediterranean, in Beirut and Mount Lebanon. There's a beautiful story that Byzantine Emperor Justinian sent a mission to China. He sent monks to steal the secrets of silk making and silk production. They came back to Beirut, they introduced it, and for centuries, the silk from Beirut, called in French la baroutine, was rather demanded on European markets. In the 17th century, with the emergence of a local provincial leader, Fakhruddin, silk slightly became the cash crop, the main cash crop to finance his expansion. And by the 19th century, France was very interested in controlling and in expanding silk production in Mount Lebanon. And French industrialists sought for their factory back in Lyon and other cities to buy the silk of Mount Lebanon. So by the second half of the 19th century, silk production became the main economic activity of Mount Lebanon. This is a small comparison, if you can, those who are following us on YouTube, between the map of Mutasarrifiyya Jabal Lubnan, the Mutasarrifiyya of Mount Lebanon, and what is now Lebanon. So we can slightly consider that this Mutasarrifiyya is the nucleus of what would later become Greater Lebanon. And this actually explains why the state established in 1920 is called Greater, as in bigger Lebanon. This Mutasarrifiyya, for almost half a century, from 1861 to 1918, was primarily an enclave of monoculture and monoproduction of silk at the service of the silk industry of Lyon in France. However, after a few decades of boom in silk production, silk prices and revenues and benefits, the price of silk cocoons, the prices of silk cocoons and thread stagnated and then fell in the 1890s. So what would happen in an economy that is concentrated along sericulture? Let's discover. So this sericulture in Mount Lebanon, far from being a leading sector of the economy, actually developed at the expense of other sectors, such as agriculture and artisanal production, which had grave consequences. So Mount Lebanon, as you know, is a mountain. So in a mountain where cultivated land is sparse, and it amounted to no more than 4% of the total surface of Mount Lebanon is actually suitable for agriculture. Thousands, in the context of sericulture, thousands of the best plots were devoted to the culture of mulberry trees. For those of you who do not know, the silkworm exclusively eats mulberry leaves. So any region that will produce silk needs to have massive mulberry tree plantations, because these silkworms need to be fed on daily basis before they weave their cocoon and produce the silk. So these massive mulberry plantations came to cover 45% of this already reduced cultivated area. So this is catastrophic, because this sericulture has developed at the expense of cereal culture. So the benefits of the sericulture were invested in buying food that Mount Lebanon did not produce and had to buy, especially from the Vilayet province in Ottoman of Damascus, and even from Egypt. Another aspect of this silk production is who was the labor force of this silk production. Look closely at the pictures, especially those who are watching on YouTube. They're kids. They're mainly women and kids working in massive factories. This is the closest Lebanon or Mount Lebanon had to the Industrial Revolution. They were kind of, between brackets, modern factories. These children boiling cocoons to loosen fibers. Why children and women were employed? For a simple reason. They were first paid less, and two, they were easier to manage because of the mentality related to gender roles back then. Women were expected to be obedient, and if you can clearly see that some men are dressed, and these were the surveyors of the workforce. Another also kid is working in the silk, with the silk threads. Ladies in a silk workshop. So where are the men? Many men refused to work in the silk factories. They considered that as degrading, because they were peasants toiling the soul. And in the gender and masculinity images, this was a slight problem. Also because they were leaving. Why they were leaving? So adding to this problem of monoculture and crisis in the silk production, there was a series of bad crop years. 1876, 77, 79, 85, 91, 85, both in sericulture and cereal culture and food production. And one that was very a crisis and these crises, to understand, those of you who are following the news in Lebanon, they're very similar, where food prices will go up and money will be lost. These crises bankrupted many peasants who already had to take loans to actually invest in their silk production, and also they took loans to anticipate the crops. So this is the burgeoning banking sector in Beirut that profited a lot from these loans. This mutasarrifiyya had, as I've stated, some privileges, but it brought new challenges. This new administrative system allowed free trade, which led to an influx of European goods into the Lebanese market. This is something that few know. The sherwel, the traditional pants that were worn in Mount Lebanon, weren't actually produced with cotton or textile that was local, that was imported from Manchester. This gives you an idea of the extent of penetration of the market into the Ottoman Empire, the European market. As a result, Mount Lebanon's economy shifted rapidly from an autarkic regime to actually trying to cope with a world economy, which required the use of cash in a traditional society that relied on barter and exchange of goods. Peasants tried to compensate for this cash deficiency by taking personal loan to buy mulberry trees necessary for this production of silk. And at the end of the 19th century, it accounted up to 82% of Mount Lebanon exports were raw silk. So as we stated earlier, 40% of the cultivated land was allocated to growing mulberry trees. This resulted in an export-driven monoculture, and Mount Lebanon had to resort to importing raw foodstuffs, such as wheat, in a period also that coincided with demographic expansion and heavy debts. In 1890, 18 years after the silk boom, the economy was heavily challenged. A silk crisis occurred as cheaper and better quality Chinese silk products flooded European markets that was previously the main destination of Lebanese silk. Add to that, so we are explaining the different factors that would push the Lebanese to leave. Improvement in healthcare in Mount Lebanon, especially with the introduction of vaccination by Western missionaries, nearly doubled the population between 1860 and 1811 from a little less than 300,000 to more than 500,000 inhabitants in a very limited space. Also, the generalization of monetary economy, in addition to a big problem in Mount Lebanon. The peasants took part in 3 massive uprisings against the elites, but actually lost the uprisings and lost their right to access to manage bigger plot of lands, and in the second half of the 19th century to actually have the means, when the Ottoman Empire allowed private property, to buy extensive lands to so there were 2 problems. First, many of the lands were still in the hands of the old feudal elite, and most of the lands in Mount Lebanon were what we call al-waqf, like church holding. The land was owned by the church, and it owned no less than 1/3 of the total land surface of Mount Lebanon also. And this is one of the reasons, one of the factors to add to the factors that pushed the inhabitants of Mount Lebanon away. The dramatic demographic growth within 2 generations quickly outspaced the ability of the mutasarrifiyya of Mount Lebanon to local economy to provide land, job, income, and food. Also, these missionaries founded medical systems. When we talk about missionaries, it's mainly the Catholic and the Protestant missionaries that mainly established the big schools and modern universities of Lebanon that helped to reduce mortality and raise the level of education to meet the needs of a flourishing tertiary sector, because Beirut became the main harbor, the main port where this silk was taken to Europe. And since we are in the age of industrialization and capitalization, the emerging banks needed personnel, and also there was an entire service sector that was developing around the silk: insurance, transportation, export, import. So these missionary schools and universities trained the locals to meet up the demands of the market. However, this demographic boom first spurred into an internal exodus. Inhabitants of Mount Lebanon went down to live in Beirut, and then to seeking jobs and better lives. And then there was a proto-Lebanese diaspora wave in Egypt. Cairo back then was a major center, a booming center, even if it was the late 19th century under British influence. It was a major center for trade, and also a major cultural center for what was back then called the Arabic Renaissance, the Nahda. And many of these Lebanese who left Mount Lebanon, especially this educated elite, would take part in this. Also, as you know, mental images play a very important role in pushing people to leave their country. This first wave of the Lebanese diaspora was facilitated by the presence of American Protestant missionaries in Mount Lebanon, in Beirut, and the Eastern Mediterranean. The same who established the Syrian Protestant College that was later on renamed the American University of Beirut. Their schools and narratives of America as it is pronounced in Arabic, painted a prosperous image of the United States and allowed for the mental leap to depart from the homeland. Also, we should never underestimate the progress of transportation means back then that would allow and make this rather easier than before. The establishment of steamship navigation and marketing enticement. As you see in one of the ads, Holland American Lines steam navigation, advanced labor contract, mail or prepaid tickets by shipping companies from the late 1870s onwards greatly eased travel and attracted migrants. The first wave of Lebanese and Syrian immigrants that we call the Syro-Lebanese immigrants, most of whom were illiterate, unskilled, and single males, remitted large sums of money that helped balance Mount Lebanon's economy and contributed to the decongestion of the cities by reducing the toll of unemployment, the direct outcome of rural exodus. If you already had done some personal research, the story of what we call Little Syria in Manhattan, in New York, is very important to understand how these migrants slowly became integrated into the social and economic and cultural fabric of the United States. So they sent money. So first they worked in petty jobs, but some actually succeeded and established shop, jewelry, and even enterprises. And they sent money to Mount Lebanon. This money was invested in building houses according to a new architecture that first emerged in Beirut and then spread to Mount Lebanon. And this is the iconic, what we call the Beiruti house. This house only appeared in the second half of the 19th century. It was back then a very modern house because most of its components wouldn't have been possible if the Industrial Revolution didn't happen. Modern bricks, casted irons, new kitchens, new WCs. So this was the outward sign that someone abroad actually succeeded and was or coming back or sending money to his family to invest. And this also, these signs of prosperity encourage young men to emigrate, leading to an immigration fever. By 1900, the remittances of the Lebanese émigrés, the diaspora, amounted to some 40% of the total revenues of Mount Lebanon. However, it hardly covered the commercial deficit, which also drained the country's gold reserves. About 45%, this is a huge number, of Mount Lebanon's population is said to have emigrated between 1860 and 1840. And just to give you an idea, as stated, I'll give you a list of references. One of the best authors that has worked on this is Dr. Akram Khater, the Lebanese Center for Lebanese Studies. Many articles that cover this history of the Lebanese diaspora. Mount Lebanon's population in 1913 is estimated to have been around 400,068 inhabitants. So these are the different factors that pushed this first wave and led to the emergence of what we call the Lebanese diaspora. However, before we end this presentation, what was the political implication? So first they were unskilled, illiterate, but then there was a new class was emerging, an educated and kind of wealthy upper middle class and a lower middle class that lived in better conditions than back home. In Beirut, in Mount Lebanon, and especially in the diaspora. So they started to actually think politically. In Beirut, they were mainly upper class bourgeois, francophone, because they studied in the missionary school. Some of them studied at the AU, at what will later become the AUB. They demanded the establishment of what will later be coined as a Greater Lebanon, an expansion of this autonomous province of Mount Lebanon to incorporate the unofficial capital back then, economic capital of Mount Lebanon, which was Beirut, and also to incorporate 3 key regions in case this new country will become viable, because it needed fertile lands to plant cereals. Jabal Amil, south, Akkar, north, and east, the Bekaa Plains were suggested as areas. These areas some were under the Ottoman province of Beirut, Vilayet Beirut, others were under the Ottoman province of Damascus. So this idea that these regions were taken from Syria is actually a complete illusion, because Syria did not exist and Lebanon did not exist as a country. Both countries did not exist back then. Sometimes the Vilayet of Damascus was called Vilayet Syria of Syria. That was the influence of especially Protestant missionaries that were using a very ancient Roman name. That wasn't the name of a country, it was the name of a province. So this idea about Lebanon being part of Syria and Syria, and it's also a complete narrative that is based on misreading historical sources. In Mount Lebanon, the main people who started to politically present or present their demands were silk factory owners, the Mutasarrifiyya bureaucrats, demands also of expanding the Mutasarrifiyya and increase the autonomy. In the diaspora, there were mainly wealthy entrepreneurs, journalists, because journalists played a major role in actually creating this cultural idea of, they sustained the use of Arabic, they published Arabic journals, music, etc., writers. They demanded independence and autonomy. So this idea of independence came from the diaspora. The 19th century is the century of nationalism, so they adopted nationalism as a model to formulate their political aspirations. To distinguish themselves from their neighbors, to highlight a certain cultural uniqueness, and to emphasize historical kinship to their community. Following the defeat of the Ottoman Empire in World War I, and between 1919 and 1920, or actually 1918, 1920, these are 2 crucial years to understand the birth of the modern states in the Middle East, on what was when France and Great Britain, the victors of the war, the mandate power, the colonial powers, rearranged the borders and established new states in the Middle East that never existed before. The demands of reflected an idea of what we call early Lebanese, revolved around these 4 key points. Expansion of Mount Lebanon for economic, and this is where they started mentioning historical reasons that there had always been a Lebanese entity since the days of the Phoenicians. And like in every nationalistic movement, you need a founding myth, and the founding father, well, the best choice candidate was Amir Fakhruddin, because when he expanded the areas that he controlled under Ottoman rule, it kind of coincided to modern Lebanon. But of course, in proper history, he's not the founder of modern Lebanon, but in the national myth, yes, he is. Also, the acknowledgement of Lebanon's right to independence and self-government within viable territories, especially this idea of expanding Mount Lebanon, adding Beirut, Akkar, South, Jabal Amil, and the Bekaa. They also expressed the desire for a parliamentary democratic regime and the willingness, given the French influence, to accept support from the French government and not mandate or occupation. So this is something that we need to keep in mind. For many Lebanese, the French mandate was a complete disappointment. And this resulted this was one of the factors that would lead to the establishment on September 1st, 1920, to proclaim the state of Greater Lebanon by the French mandate, an idea, a state where the diaspora would have a major role in running and later transforming this Greater Lebanon in 1926 into the Al-Jumhuriyya Al-Lubnaniyya, the Republic of North Lebanon, in drafting the constitution and later on in running the new country. This last slide is a slide where I propose some of the key works and references on Lebanese diaspora, on Lebanese narratives, and especially on the birth of the state of modern Lebanon. And I'm open for questions now.
Thank you so much. I wish this was very, very inciting and very helpful. هلا أنا حبلش my first question. يطلع لا بلش بالأول.
Yes, of course.
So, is there a founder of the Greater Lebanon? في حدا معين فينا نعطيه the credit?
Well, if we want to completely go to history, yes, it's General Henri Gouraud. It's to a very large extent. The decision to proclaim Greater Lebanon as a state in its current border was, to a very large extent, his personal decision. Of course, he took into consideration what the proto-Lebanists were voicing, the locals, especially the Maronite church and the educated elites, mainly Maronites and Greek Melkites, Rum al-Catholique, and of course, the diaspora thinkers, Boulos and Jem, Naum Kerzel in the United States. So, but he can be considered, as you know, in Latin, we say pater patriae, the father of the nation, as the father of the nation.
Very nice. Okay, I'm going to read some of the questions, and if anybody has any question, you can just either type it on YouTube or you can type it on Instagram Live, and I'll just read it out loud. There was a question that says, so why do we think we are more evolved than other Arab countries beside Egypt? This is from Mr. Jihad.
Yeah, this is Jihad. This is actually a narrative that is quite common in Lebanon. And there are no proper studies on why this evolved, but it could probably be linked to what the missionaries used to teach, and this idea of people being evaluated according to certain levels of civilization, as if civilization was something that you could coin on levels. This is an inheritance from this colonial missionary mindset where people are divided into different levels of civilization. Well, even if compared to what was back then, Greater Lebanon wasn't that developed. It had major problems, it lacked proper infrastructure, and it's something that we couldn't even compare with Egypt that was very modern back then, especially the urban centers and not the rural areas that were neglected. So most probably it's something we inherited from the colonial narrative and the French missionary narratives. And it's also linked slightly to the idea that these missionaries came in the idea that Christianity is a more developed, a more civilized religion. But this is there, I'm not saying that. This is what the missionaries used to say.
Thank you for that. Another question from Nadine, and I think it's interesting. What kind of travel documents did these immigrants have at the time?
This is a very good question, actually. First, we need to keep in mind that many of these immigrants were smuggled out illegally of Mount Lebanon. Counter to the narrative where the Ottomans were persecuting, and they were actually trying to keep the inhabitants of Mount Lebanon in Lebanon. So they first issued the first tizkara. Tizkara is still a name for the Lebanese identity card. There was something called the Naouloun, which was the ticket, but there wasn't properly an Ottoman passport. There was something like the manifesto of where you had the name. So when they arrived to Ellis Island, many were actually registered as Turcos, as coming Turks, as coming from the Ottoman Empire. But I need to emphasize that they were actually, many of them were smuggled illegally out of the Ottoman Empire.
Thank you. Okay, we have a lot of questions pouring in, so I'm going to try to get through all of them. في عنا a question from a friend of mine, actually. To what extent can you situate the creation of Greater Lebanon within the global discourse on minority rights, which Hannah Ardant, for example, presents in Eastern Europe?
First, this narrative of Greater Lebanon being a country created for the Maronites were heavily used by the French mandate to justify their rule. This is something that is very important to keep in mind. French mandate relied heavily on what the local missionaries wrote on the region. And the local missionaries depicted the Christian communities as being minorities and as being persecuted minorities that needed to be protected from a Muslim majority. So this is the European missionary discourse that was officially used to justify the creation of Greater Lebanon. And it still is part of the different narratives circulating in Lebanon to justify why Lebanon exists as a country that was created for minorities seeking asylum and refuge from the majority. However, historically, this is not true.
I bet how we always there's a lot of things that we think, this is the right thing, and now we're just refuting them. And it's very interesting and very informative. We have another question from Mr. Walid. As an academic who understands Lebanon's history and the different communities, what is your say on federalism? Interesting.
It's not my domain to explain federalism. Asking historians about their personal opinion on things is actually pushing them to first be unprofessional, and second, to give their opinion on political matters. I'm not a political scientist. I have no idea how to evaluate if federalism is the solution to Lebanon's problem. If I might answer, I'll answer as Charles and not as a historian. It's definitely not the solution for any problems. So one of the main solutions is the problem is at its core a corrupt, irresponsible elite. I can't see how federalism will bring a solution. Plus, Lebanon is so tiny and so little that is it a point to divide it into even more identities and more region? I think this is, but I think my position is clear. I'm completely against that. As a historian, well, this federalism was never used in Lebanon. Decentralization, yes, definitely. This is a modern approach to better management, but dividing the country into like mini countries, each region in Lebanon thinks that they are the center of an empire that stretches all over to global dimension. But that's it.
Agreed. Thank you for your personal input. Ana Silvana, I second that. We have a question from Vanessa. It says, my family says they left Lebanon in the 19th century because of religious persecution as Christians. How does that fit in?
Can you
so her question was, my family says they left Lebanon in the 19th century because of religious persecution as Christians.
Yeah, the narrative was widespread. This narrative was widespread in many aspects of this phase of the first diaspora. When they arrived to their new countries, they said that we're persecuted because these new countries were mainly Christians. So the new word was Christian. So they needed to justify, and they needed to find common grounds to integrate in this new society, and they used Christianity and the idea that they were persecuted to fit in, especially in countries where you have very active Protestant churches, where in their upbringing they would actually know, they would have a better understanding of the geography of the Holy Land, and they would know that they would have some idea about Lebanon being mentioned in the Bible. So it was their way of telling them, listen, we have something in common. We are Christians as you. We are persecuted, so it's up to you to protect us and integrate us. But persecution was not historically the factor that pushed the inhabitants of Ottoman Mount Lebanon to leave Mount Lebanon. Because the majority left after these sectarian wars ended, and not during the sectarian wars.
Thank you for that. We have a couple of questions on YouTube, and then I'll come back on Instagram. Abdu says, you said that 45% were mulberry trees in Mount Lebanon. What happened to those trees, and how did the pine trees invade the land?
Very good question. First, the pine trees did not invade the land. There were already some pine forests, because as you know, pine was used as one of the main components of our culinary heritage. Then it was used for wood, for construction. And we tend to forget something. The areas where you have the pine forest, especially in central Mount Lebanon, in the Mejtemiin area, are areas that had, believe it or not, iron mines. And you needed the wood to actually smelt the iron. This is one. Two, the majority of the mulberry trees were uprooted because when the French Mandate started, the silk sector was completely destroyed. So what to do with unproductive land? This is where the mulberry trees were uprooted. In the highlands, they were replaced by apple trees and fruit trees, and on the coast, some of them were replaced by citrus trees and banana plantations.
Thank you for that. We have another question that also I think it's interesting. When they decided to add Biqa, Aqar, and the Jabal Amil, how were Tripoli, Saida, and Sur added?
Okay, so a mental map of Ottoman Lebanon in 1918. So when the Ottoman Empire collapsed, the Ottoman rule ended, not collapsed. What we call now Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, Jordan were divided into a big coastal province called Wilayat Beirut. This is where Tripoli and Saida were, and the main cities on the Syrian coast and Palestinian coast. There was a big Wilayat Dimashq or Suria that had the Biqa and the other cities. There was also Wilayat Halab. There were two Mutasarrifiyas, Mutasarrifiyat Jabal Lubnan and Mutasarrifiyat Quds or Jerusalem. The idea to add these regions was presented by these proto-Lebanists as a solution to make Mount Lebanon viable economically. On another level, they were added by a political decision and a legal decision by General Goro, who in the month prior to September 1st, 1920, actually took legal measures to first dismantle the Wilayat Beirut and Wilayat Dimashq and to remove different districts from these wilayas and add them to the Mutasarrifiyya of Mount Lebanon, and then declare the birth of a new country. So it was a legal and a political decision to rearrange the area and to create this new country.
We have a question from Anthony that says, so the 1860 massacres are not considered prosecution?
The diaspora doesn't correspond to 1860. This is something very important. The let's define persecution before giving very large titles to what happened. Yes, there were sectarian massacres. Yes, Druze and Muslims killed Christians, but we need to understand why and when and how it happened. Persecution is a rather very big title to something that is way more complex than then. In the aftermath of 1860, there was no massive movement to the United States. This happened after 1870. And as I explained, the main factor was economic and not religious.
Thank you for that clarification. We have a question from Ralph. I'm going to go back to Instagram now for a little bit on Saru Ktar. Charles, thanks a lot for the cultured man you are. My question would be, what about Tartus and other Christian coastal cities in Syria today? We sometimes hear that they could have been a part of Lebanon.
Well, Tartus was never proposed as part of Lebanon. The only part of what is now modern Syria that might have been part of Lebanon was Wadi al-Nasara, a region not far from Homs, the Valley of the Christian, that has a slightly large Christian majority. Some of these proto-Lebanese thinkers proposed that this region must be added to the new countries to make make the Christian majority even more present, to up to 18% majority. However, we really don't know why they weren't added. Some actually present a very funny narrative that because these regions are actually Rome Orthodox, the Maronite Church refused. However, even if you added these regions to Lebanon, the Maronites would stay the majority. So probably it's something related to strategical French military considerations. We still don't have a lot of studies around why the borders were placed where they are now and how in details this decision was taken.
Thank you for that. We have a question that says, before banks, how was the diaspora transferring support to their families in Mount Lebanon?
Very good question. Actually, they would send the money in the ships as gold coins.
Okay. We have another question that says, how can we learn about our civilization? It seems like this knowledge is lost. If not, then where do you think we should go for that knowledge?
Books.
Okay.
Proper historical studies would be, well, what civilization? The Arab civilization, the Phoenician civilization, the Ottoman civilization, but let me make something very clear. There are few secrets on this area. Major historians, both local and international, have made an absolutely exceptional job in explaining and sharing many aspects. And so all we have to do is go and read. And on YouTube, I'm not sure if it is still visible, the list of books I'm proposing.
Yeah, it's still visible.
You can start there.
So what Charles is talking about, if you are on YouTube, he has a list of books and you can still see it. And to access YouTube, you can just go on our Instagram page, Bil bio, you can just click on the link and then just click on From an Eon to Lebanon, and you can see the presentation. It's still visible, and you can just take a screenshot of it and you can get the books on your own.
Some of the books are even available as open edition.
Oh, very nice.
That's very nice.
Yeah.
Given how expensive books are now in Lebanon.
Yes, definitely. Books are cheaper nonetheless. So we have a question from Mazen. Who was worse to Lebanon, the French or the Ottomans?
Comparing who is worse gives you absolutely nothing in history. It's not a competition of who is best or who is worse. Binary logics in history gives you a completely weird vision. First, the French were here for 26 years. The Ottomans were here for 400 years. So we cannot even compare on positive or negative levels what happened.
Thank you for that. We have a question from Baha that actually asks about the history of Druze and Christians' relationships in Mount Lebanon. Very sensitive.
What's the question?
So can you please describe the history of Druze and Christians' relationship in Mount Lebanon?
In 1 minute? I can't. It's a beautiful history of cooperation, coexistence that sadly, and here I speak personally, had some episodes of extreme violence from both sides. This is what the narrative doesn't tell you. In 1841, 1845, 1860, and recently 1883. But, however, these two communities enjoyed, for most of their history, peace. And if they can be considered, if you want to go to this nationalistic vision of narrative, or even in proper chronological history, as the nucleus of what would later become Lebanon was born in this interaction between the Maronites and the Druze.
I'm actually interested in the topic. I know ما عنا وقت, I know it needs its own time, but نحن in Lebanon, they never talk about civil war. ولا عنا something like a proper book or a proper curriculum بالمدارس بيحكي عن civil war. ليه civil war تابو؟ ليه ما فينا نتعلم من أخطاء اللي صاروا بالcivil war وما نصير نعيدهم later on?
Yeah, it's a very good question. Let's put things into perspective. First, we need to know that in the 90s and up until nowadays, many private historians, history teachers, made an extraordinary job in documenting the Civil War, in explaining the narrative of the Civil War, and in breaking the taboo. Even I have friends of mine who are colleagues who actually explain and do entire workshops around the Civil War in high schools. And this is magnificent, because this is the proper way. The problem is not that the subject is taboo. Officially, when a civil war ends, the state that emerges after, the political power that emerges after a civil war, first goes for muhasabe. I forgot the word in English. Accountability for the crimes. And then they go on working on a collective memory. These things did not happen in Lebanon. They did not happen in Lebanon on an official level. And this is why the civil war is absent from education. However, the civil society and very brave historians and colleagues and artists and different activists are actually bringing them or archiving it. But officially, there is nothing. That's the problem. So we need to balance. So there is work, there is substantial work on the narrative. Many Lebanese historians published beautiful books on the matter. And I say beautiful, beautifully written. And they don't, where they tackle all the aspects, even the bloodiest events. And the big archive, private archives that have been done. Problem is that the state did not adopt any accountability or any collective work around the collective memory of the Civil War. And of course, as one of the participants is stating, they're still here. The warlords are still controlling the country.
That is true. Thank you for that. We have an interesting question from Pamela that says, a nation can learn a lot from its history. What can the current diaspora learn from the historic important role of the diaspora in terms of concrete actions?
A very good question, actually. On two levels, on two dimensions, the diaspora was crucial in Lebanon. First, economically, let's be very, very clear about that. And second, politically, because as they played a big role in the emergence of 1920 Greater Lebanon, they were also kind of a force of change. So maybe the Lebanese diaspora now can be this new force of change. I don't know. But how this is where historically it was, and culturally it contributed a lot to the cultural life of Lebanon.
هو the plan إن نحن نكون the change. أهم شيء.
Yes. Yes. Hopefully.
We have a question from Nadine that says, Does history tell us what was the Lebanese stance on the World War II campaigns?
Okay, I see. It's a nice question, actually. First, we need to know that Lebanon officially did not declare war on the Axis. But given that Lebanon was under French mandate, it de facto took part in the war. This is one. Two, few Lebanese know that we were actually under Nazi influence for a year. Because when France was occupied by Nazi Germany, there was a new French government called the Vichy government that controlled most of the French mandate and colonies. And the Vichy government controlled Lebanon and Syria for a year. And the British and the Free French mounted a massive military campaign called Operation Exporter, or the Syria campaign, and many Australians took part in it. And there were many immigrants, Lebanese immigrants, Australian immigrants, descendants of Lebanese families who actually took part. Locally, Lebanese were, well, we don't have a real study if they were very enthusiastic to one or another, but we know that in 1941, there was a certain ambiance in the country that they got rid of a very corrupt and restrictive government, especially that under Vichy Lebanon for a year, it was an economic crisis that looks a lot like the one we're experiencing now, where food prices were.
Okay, I think we're a lot over time, بس رح اخذ one more question. صراحة تشارل ما عم ضحك، عن جد ما عم ضحك. So, was there any real reconciliation between the Lebanese after the civil wars from the 1800s until today?
That's a very big historical scope to it. So let me just put it, let me talk about the last civil war, because in the 1860s, we can't go back. Well, officially no, but on a social level, Lebanese citizens, yes, this happened, even if we don't recognize that, and there was no like official reconciliation day or something, because these remembrance day, if the thing is not complete, they mean absolutely nothing. But this happened. The Lebanese are in some areas re-established this social link that existed before the Civil War, trans-communitarian and trans-sectarian identity. Because this idea that the Lebanese are profoundly a sectarian people, this is the product of a political corrupt elite, an economic system that used and produced this sectarian narrative. So reconciliation happened in many areas. In many areas, it did not happen. Officially, no, it did not happen.
That is true. It didn't. بس فينا نحن بيننا وبين حالنا, we could like reconcile هذا problem وخلص. Whatever in the past, leave it in the past, and we focus on the future.
Exactly. This idea that we are different cultures or different civilizations that live. يا جماعة, it's 10,000 كيلومتر مربع. It cannot fit that much. This idea, the shared heritage, it is way more interesting than the little small differences that are actually products of mainly corruption and sectarianism and
okay, so I'm gonna end with this note لأنه I think everyone is curious to know this. What is one of the main or most comprehensive archive of the Civil War? يعني حابين العالم يعرفوا where to go to learn.
Archives of the Civil War. First, there is no one archive of the Civil War. There is the magnificent work that the late Luqman Slim was trying to do to document, so you can go there. There's a page of a colleague of mine, Samer Al-Assis. He's a military historian. It's called Lebanese Civil War, the military history of the Lebanese Civil War. It's on Facebook. He tackles very delicate issues because he actually explains what different type of arms were used by the belligerents. I would recommend both. I would also, because what the late Luqman did is not only break the taboo, but actually proper documentation of historical material that reflects the lives of the civilians during a civil war, something that few Lebanese. You have also the archives of the different press, L'Orient Le Jour, As-Safir, and you have some documentaries that were produced, but they're mainly some TV documentaries, but they're extremely bad.
Perfect. فينا نزيد دقيقتين لأنه
Yes, we can go for 5 minutes. No way.
Okay. What is the history and explanation of the zigzag border while the other Arab countries in the area have a straight line border?
Well, this is an idea that has nothing to do with us. The zigzag borders is just that the French decided that mountaintops and rivers for Lebanon and some parts of Syria and the British in Iraq are the borders. In Egypt, you're talking about deserts. This is why you have this very geometrical. It's the colonial powers that are that drew these borders, or in the second half of the 19th century, or in the aftermath of the First World War, and they have nothing to do with either if the country is natural or artificial, because in history it means absolutely nothing if your country is natural, بلد طبيعي أو حدود طبيعية, or حدود اصطناعية. So it means absolutely nothing.
Okay, last two questions. I promise I'll آخر اثنين.
Okay.
Mr. Khalid asked, what do you think about the Jazeera documentary on the Civil War? أنا personally ما حضرته, so I don't.
No comment.
Okay. You guys got the gist. آخر question. Do historians like you sometimes use histories from the past to extrapolate the future, or does the discipline mostly is a look back?
Well, the discipline is mostly a look back, because we really can't foresee what's happening in the future. And any historian who would tell you that I'm here to foresee the future is actually a charlatan. It's very dangerous. We can try to understand the current situation by going back to history, but we cannot foresee what's happening. And it's not the job of any historian to foresee the future.
Okay, Muhammad, hi, آخر question. I'm going to take it, guys. No more questions. I'm really sorry, but we're really above time. The Maronite community in Cyprus, are they considered Lebanese by roots?
Because the Maronite community in Cyprus is way older than Lebanon.
Mm-hmm.
They are linked spiritually to the Maronite church, administratively so they have a bishop, but they do not have any legal link with Lebanon. It's a good idea actually to give them Lebanese nationality.
مش غلط خلاص كله عنده Lebanese roots.
Yeah, but we need to ask them if they consider themselves Lebanese.
بعدين عم بيصير I doubt it, but let's see.
So we're talking about the community that left in the 9th century and 13th century, so there was no Lebanon.
Yeah, 100%, I agree. Okay, we have to stop here. Thank you guys so much. Shar, this was amazing. And I have to say, on behalf of the entire Meghterbin Mejtemiin, نحن personally as the diaspora, we learned a lot. And I have to be certain that this is not going to be the last collaboration. مع حضرتك, honestly, we are very proud to have such intellectual person عنا بالcommunity. عن جد, we need a lot of people like you. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you guys for listening. Thank you guys for tuning in. And we're sorry for the technical difficulties. أول شيء, but we'll be back another time. Bye everybody.
Thank you Silvana. شاعر من دون حضرتك هيدي بحضور بكل سرور. Thank you, and thank you for everyone for tuning in.
Thank you guys. Bye.
Bye.